Noon. Well, thank you for coming back. And thank you for the wonderful conversations between last session and this session. And be happy to continue those conversations with you as well. I know there's a lot of questions, and some of them specific, others more general, and I certainly can appreciate all of that. And at the end, if you were not here for the morning session, I'll also have my email up there. It's a really old one. It's a CompuServe thing. And yeah, I know. My kids say the same thing. You know, we were walking on a family vacation once, and I was wearing cargo pants, and my kids said, "Dad, no, you can't do that." So I held on to it. Now they're back in, you know. So now they want to be seen with me again. It's really interesting how that works. So, I'll provide the email address, and there's business cards down on the Veritas resource table. I also have some with me, I think, as well. So feel free to call or text or write or just swing by the house unannounced. Any of that stuff is absolutely fine with us. So let's pray, and then we'll move into our afternoon. Father, again, we're grateful for the time before us, the time that we can spend thinking about how we can be most effective in our service to you by giving ourselves in the care of others. Lord, guide our conversation this afternoon. We pray it in Christ's name. Amen. So this morning I talked about what not to do. And this afternoon I'm going to talk a little bit more about what to do. And for those of you who were here this morning, you've got a distinct advantage, because when you don't know what to do, you ought to know what not to do. And so that's good. Let's begin. And again, this is going to be little more than bullet point. All of this is laid out for you in far greater detail in the pastor's book, and that's down on the Veritas resource table if you want to get a copy of that. The chapter in there on pastoral counseling is the one that I contributed to that book, and this is all laid out for you in much greater detail in the book. But this is kind of skipping a stone across that particular chapter, or at least a section in that chapter. But in terms of receiving pastoral counseling referrals, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Yeah. Usually I find it preferable if people are self-referred over against getting a third-party referral. I think that sometimes people will call me and say, "I think so-and-so is really in trouble, wondering if you might be willing to reach out to them and see if you could offer your services to them." And I find it generally preferable to say, you know, if you're concerned for them, probably the good thing for you to do would be, here's my number, here's my name, here's how I can be contacted. Please have them feel free to contact me. The self-referrals are, I think, two things happen that are helpful. One, if people are self-referred, generally they're more apt to believe that they have an issue of concern that needs to be addressed over against someone else coming to them saying, "I think there's issues of concern for you here. Why don't I contact this person for you?" It's always better. I realize it's a little more challenging because people have to kind of muster it up to call me. But generally, when people call me and say, "I'm reaching out, I've been encouraged by my pastor or some family members, I think I need to talk to somebody, wondering if I can connect with you," there's some basic level of awareness that there's issues of concern that they want to work on. And then the second advantage is that they're far more likely to follow through on showing up and working with me than if they're referred by someone else. One of the things when I was in private practice that I really didn't enjoy all that much, probably one of my least favorite things to do when I was in private practice, was receiving court referrals. Occasionally the judge would say, "All right, you have to go see a a psychologist, psychiatrist, 10 sessions, here's the name and number for Dr. Evans, and you got to see him for 10 sessions, have him sign off at the end, and then send it to the court. Well, you can imagine how that went over, kind of like a pregnant pole vaulter. It did not go well at all. I did have people occasionally walk in, this happened more than once, where somebody walked in, opened my door and said, Dr. Evans, which number is this? 10. Put me down. I was here. Thanks. And out the door they went. Just not motivated. There's no awareness that there's issues of concern. They're not motivated to follow through, and they're not motivated to work in counseling. If they're self-referred, that's a good sign that there's some level of awareness. And then it allows you in that first session to say, when they come in and they say sometimes, I don't know where to begin. Well, tell me about what it is that you were kind of thinking or feeling that prompted you to then clear that hurdle and make that phone call to me. What was it in that moment that you were thinking about? That becomes then a very powerful starting point. Instead of having somebody sit there and say, well, Mary and John think I need to talk to you. Well, if Mary and John were here today, what do you think would be the reason they would tell me as to why they're encouraging you to be here? I have no idea. Well, I've got the wrong people in the room. Okay? Now, if people are incapacitated or they're engaged in or seriously contemplating something that's unbiblical or immoral, illegal, then of course you need to take the initiative. I was called once where somebody showed up drunk and belligerent to a men's Bible study. And I happened not to be there. I was at the office for another appointment. They contacted me, and I said, okay, I'm on my way. I couldn't very well say, well, give them some coffee and encourage them to call me in the morning. It was one of these things I had to go and I had to initiate in that particular instance. Or if somebody we've had people occasionally show up, they'll be out in the parking lot or something, and they're grossly incapacitated, you need to go out there and initiate that contact. But all things being equal, it's preferable to have people self-refer. In short, while self-referrals are preferable, I do think that as pastors we need to be like the Good Shepherd. And the Good Shepherd does go after the haggard sheep. So don't let somebody out there who is struggling continue to struggle because they just simply do not have the ability to connect with you. At the very least, what I try to do is put myself in close proximity to that person and not come alongside on Sunday and say, gee, I hear you're really having a hard time. That's going to fuel, well, who's talking about me? Who's gossiping in the church? Why is it coming to you? Why aren't they talking to me? But to just put myself in close proximity to that individual. And usually it doesn't take much more than, how's your week been? Oh, it's been pretty hard. Would you have some time to meet with me this week? I'd love to connect with you. I want to hear your heart. And that's usually all that it takes. Preparing for the first session, arrange for a time and place that's free from distractions. You don't want to do your counseling in the youth room when the bouncy balls are going off next door. I don't meet in public places where there's a lot of noise or distractions. My offices, I had the walls were corked, and I had gaskets around the door. And so they were soundproof rooms, and I have a white noise machine. And the white noise machine went outside my office door. I now do much of my work from a home office, which is on the 4th floor of our house, separated from the rest of the house. And I put a white noise machine in the stairwell. So you can't, even though there's nobody going up on the 3rd floor of the house, much less up to my office, there's no possible way of hearing what's going on. And the gasket on my door was such that actually when you went, you couldn't actually shut the door, you had to lean on the door. It was kind of almost like a vacuum seal and allow people to come in. I wanted it to be completely silent. so that people felt the freedom to share whatever they wanted to share without fear of being overheard. I give specific instructions on where, when, and how to arrive, not simply, why don't you just meet me at the church, I'll be there at 5:30. Can you imagine someone unfamiliar with this church showing up at 5:30 trying to find you? The other thing too is I don't want people wandering through the church asking where I am, because it reveals something about the reason for which they may be seeking me out. Do you know where Dr. Evans is? Well, do you have an appointment? Yes, at 5:30. That's not the kind of way you want to start out. So here's where you park. There's a Stellware here, and I'll meet you down in the lobby at 5:30. Just wait right there. If anybody asks you if you need help, I've told the office administrator that it's fine. I'm expecting somebody, they'll leave you alone and just say, I'm fine, thank you very much, or whatever it is. Give specific details. The meeting place should be appropriately prepared for counseling. Again, simple, clean, modest. I do have a picture of my wife and my kids on my desk, but it's turned the other way. So people in the counseling area aren't having to look at that. Again, if I've got somebody in there in marital strife, I think the last thing they want to be doing is spending an hour or two with me in my office looking at a picture that celebrates the blessedness of something that's brought you into my office that you're struggling with at present. I don't put any trophies, medals, awards, certificates, diplomas, any of that kind of stuff on the wall. I've got my ordination certificate that's over in the corner, kind of unobtrusive, and that's it. The rest of it is done rather cleanly and tastefully. I have a large painting on the wall that just allows people to kind of project. It gives them some vista and space to be able to just kind of have a blank theme. It's not the crucified Christ hanging over them or anything that's going to kind of pull for those kinds of emotive themes. I don't have a lot of Bible verses or anything like that on the wall. I'm not adverse to Scripture, mind you. Just I want it to be as simple and clean so people can kind of project what it is that's going on instead of pulling from them or triggering them from them the responses that they might not otherwise have. Pay attention to the lighting and temperature. I like to use a lot of indirect lighting. I don't usually have something like this pointing in the chair. So where were you on Thursday night? I don't know. I don't remember. So I do a lot of indirect lighting to make it kind of soft, more of a living room environment, more conversational in its style. And then the temperature, I tend to run hot. And so I would, second session, people are walking in, they look like Nanook from the north, muffler, ear things going on, down parka. So be sensitive to lighting and temperature issues, and particularly if people are taking psychotropic medications of some sort, that can sometimes vary their temperature sensitivities as well. So just be aware of that. Greeting the counselee. Counseling really starts before the meeting. I would argue that actually everything is grist for the mill. My very first day of grad school in training to be a psychologist, somebody wrote on the board, if you're early, you're anxious, if you're late, you're hostile, and if you're right on time, you're obsessive compulsive. So I checked my watch, I was 7 minutes early, so I assumed I was probably anxious. So everything is kind of grist for the mill. It is interesting to me that by and large, when people show up early, that it tends to be a little more suggestive. I wonder about anxiety. If they show up late, I wonder about a little more either depression or aggression. It is very interesting to me how that tends to correlate. I pay attention to how people are dressed. People are wearing bright colored muumuus in the middle of January and it's winter outside. You wonder about that. Or if they're wearing kind of a lot of just consistently achromatic colors. Well, there's no achromatic colors. They're just wearing achromatic tones. That's also suggestive. And then what I try to do is to wait until I invite the person back to my office, but I allow them to lead. I try to keep the number of words that I use when greeting somebody to an absolute minimum. Good morning, it's good to see you. Please, come on back. I don't want to have anything triggered out in the waiting area that if somebody else was walking by, they'd hear. So I don't want to, well, how are you doing today? I don't want to ask that, because I don't want it to start out in the public place. That needs to be reserved for when they're in the room. Come out, shake my hand, please, come on back. And then I follow them. I'm paying attention to their gait, their pace, how the head is positioned. Everything becomes grist for the mill. Usually get to the door, what happens is they'll stand in the doorway and say, where would you want me to sit? I usually tell people at that time, make yourself comfortable. Well, where do you sit? Wherever you don't. I don't have a reserved seat. Wherever you'd like to sit is fine with me. I find that very helpful. If it's a married couple and they come in, one sits on a couch and the other one sits in a freestanding chair, suggestive. They're sitting on a 3-person couch, which is what I have, but they're sitting next to each other. That's suggestive of something else. So all of that stuff is grist for the mill. If I have somebody who is coming to me and they've been very aggressive, I would sometimes see people, they are on parole or these kinds of things, are very manipulative, very controlling. Occasionally, I would maneuver them around the room. We don't manipulate people, but I'd maneuver them. So they'd walk in the room, sit down someplace, and I could recast this in a moment and say, would you do me a favor? Could I ask you please just sit over here for today? That would be very helpful. Thank you. They go sit. What am I doing? I'm establishing that you're not in control of this session. Very powerful way of establishing in a very non-directive way, but directive, that you're not manipulating me in this. Depending on the cultural issues, also while I normally start with a handshake, I realize there are some cultural contexts in which you don't do that. And so you need to be kind of sensitive to that. Sometimes in Asian contexts and so on, that's not what you do. Or if you're meeting with the wife, there's a certain boundary that needs to be observed. I want to be very careful to do that. So I may just simply come out and say, thank you for coming today. Please come back. And then I just gesture and allow them to find their way. Again, other than an appropriate handshake, no other physical contact. Particularly in that initial session, you're setting yourself up for some real problems. You go in for the hug. Oh, it's so good to see you. Thank you for coming here. You're gonna have some challenges. You don't know, but that unconsciously, I get a hug every time I see the pastor. That feels good because I'm not getting that at home. You just need to be very careful about those kinds of things. Settling the counselee, I usually follow the counselee to the counseling area as appropriate. If I've got somebody who's highly anxious or paranoid, I don't do that. I'll walk with them or walk slightly in front of them, but I'll turn. I want them to be in safe space. I don't want to be following them if they're highly anxious or nervous. I usually offer something to drink, decaffeinated. Water's always safe, decaf coffee. Again, if people are on psychotropic medications, particularly classification of medications called tricyclic antidepressants, TCAs, they have what are called anticholinergic side effects, which include, among other things, decreased lacrimation, where a person doesn't tear as much, dry mouth, urinary retention, dry, itchy skin, some GI upset, and so on. Here in the Rocky Mountain region, our fluid intake tends to go up anyway. People who are on psychotropics tend to have a little more dry mouth, and so you may be able to put them at ease by offering them something to drink. Allow the counselee to select his or her preferred seating. Usually, I offer a variety of seating options. It gives me an idea as to what I'm dealing with. So I may have like a love seat, I may have a couch, I may have a couple of tables. There's some chairs that can be pulled up if we're going to have extended sessions with one another. And I do pay attention to where people sit. And so it gives me kind of an early clue as to what's going on. I attempt to sit no higher, preferably lower than the counselee. I'm near 6'5", and so that's, for 45 years, been a real challenge for me. It starts out in the waiting area. Hi, how are you? That can be a little off-putting. And so I tend to scooch down in chairs as low as I can possibly go without looking too terribly awkward or sliding out of the cushion. But if people are feeling more anxious or depressed or intimidated, to be sitting then above them, looking down, adds another dynamic to things that can be a bit intimidating that's not intended. I want to be no higher, if I possibly can, than eye level, which means sometimes, like in the cushions in our couches, we've sometimes had to reinforce them from underneath because they break down over the years. And we've got to get people kind of plumped back up if that's where they go. I don't counsel from like behind a desk or a large piece of furniture. That's rather imposing. I'm sorry, did you say something? I can hardly see. There you are. So nothing more than a casual coffee table that's small. And then avoid sitting between the counselee and an exit. You don't want people to feel cornered. I've known of more than one psychologist who has been hurt when this was not given due attention and when the bull takes to flight because they're overwhelmed, trying to make it to the door, they were the only thing between where the person was and the door. So I sit in a place where they always have access to the door, even from a psychological perspective, for somebody to feel like they're sitting here, I've shut the door, and now I'm in here. It's kind of like for some people when they got an airplane and there's no exit door nearby, there's no place for me to go. Not that you would at 35,000, but there's something comforting to know there's something where I can get out if I need to. I realize this is a massive debate. Door open or door ajar. I spend quite a bit of time in the book, the pastor's book, talking about the pros and cons of this. Being a psychologist, of course, I'm not able to practice with a door ajar. That's unethical and it's unprofessional, and I can't do it. And I carry that into my pastoral counseling role. When I was counseling as a pastor, I had frosted glass where somebody could be walking outside but could not see who was in. And then in the section that had a bookshelf there where you could not see into the counseling section, there was a full window there. So a person could see my desk, they could see midway into the office, but they couldn't see the counseling area, and if you got down by the counseling area, it was frosted glass. To have a door open, of course, the thought is that it controls for inappropriate behavior. If there's a thought that somebody could walk by, see us engaged in a compromising position, that offers some comfort. Controls for inappropriate conversations where you're not talking about things that are actually essential to the reasons for why you're there. And it protects potentially against false accusations. There are then the cons to all of those pros. What about the woman who says, gee, is the only thing that's keeping you from being inappropriate with me the fact that there's an open door? Is the only thing that's keeping you from acting in ways that are appropriate is the thought that we may get caught if you don't? Do you not trust yourself enough to be in a closed room with me, but you need to have a prop in order to keep your behavior under control? Do you have enough allegations against your character that you found it necessary to make sure that, there's there are cons to doing this as well that you need to be mindful of. I can't tell you what to do, but you need to weigh out the pros and cons of that. The door closed, this should say door closed, sorry. It obviously protects confidentiality. Things that are being said in there cannot be heard. Encourages openness, transparency, and honesty. Because I don't know who may be sitting outside or walked outside or is sitting in the waiting area listening to this, or what if somebody walks by and just hears me say a few words. I want to hear the whole thing. And then it protects the counseling dynamics as well. All the things that I just talked about, gee, is the only thing that's keeping you from acting inappropriate, that you have an open door. It's the same thing, I realize for some pastors, they've said, to counselees, don't tell me anything that I can't tell my wife. I've never done that. In fact, my wife and I, before we got engaged, I said, because I was already a psychologist when we were getting married, I said, what would it be like for you to be married to somebody who can't actually talk about their day? I mean, I can talk in the general terms. I can come home at the end of the day, how was your day? It was fine, it was difficult, it was a bit of a challenge, whatever it is. But what would it be like for you that I can't share my day with you? I cannot give specifics. Is that okay with you? Now, what ended up happening is we were married for a year, then my wife went to law school. And so I'm married to an attorney who means a couple of things. One, I haven't won an argument in 35 years. And second, she also has to abide by confidentiality. So she understands this quite well. And so it becomes one of these things at the end of the day, how was your day? Fine. Yours? Fine. Great. Well, let's have dinner now that we got our days out of the way. So I realize for some, you'll say that. The challenge, of course, you need to weigh that against is then the person you're counseling with realizes I'm not just talking to you, I'm talking to at least two people. And maybe you will subscribe to confidentiality, but is your wife bound to confidentiality? Is she somehow licensed or credentialed, or I didn't see her name on the disclosure list? Where does this information go? Need to be very careful. Starting this session, as appropriate, I either open and or close a session in prayer. I say as appropriate. Sometimes people start before their seat hits the couch. Well, it's been a really difficult week. This has been really hard. I've been looking forward to talking with you because I've got a lot of stuff on my heart and mind. At that point, they've already started. I really don't feel the freedom to say, well, before you go any further, let's bow in a word of prayer. I feel like I'm kind of moving the gaze of our focus, and so I'll allow them to go and pray at the end. Other times they may sit with me, and I'll say, why don't we open in prayer today? So do that as appropriate. My opening question, I would encourage you to be as broad as possible. What would you like to talk about today? That's a pretty good opening line. Well, I don't know. As you were driving here today, what were some of the things you were thinking about as you came? Well, I was thinking about this, that, and the other thing. As you were sitting down in the waiting area, what were some of the thoughts you had? Last week, bring me up to date. We were discussing this. Have you thought more about what we talked about last week? Keep it as open as, rather than asking for things that are specific. You want to get them talking. Good counseling is like giving a ball a little bit of a tap and allowing it to roll and giving the minimum amount of tap to keep that ball rolling. Avoid humor. Again, it's usually employed as a defense against anxiety, yours and or the counselee. I talked about some of this morning. Gently redirect as necessary. Listen attentively. Do not interrupt. Again, if the eyes avert, allow them the space and time to feel their feelings and to think their thoughts. Something is bubbling up. They're making connections in their heart and mind. Don't interrupt that. That's good work going on right there. When they're ready to re-engage with you, they'll bring their eyes back up and look you in the eye. Or they'll lean back and sigh. They'll signal to you, I'm done processing what I was processing. Where would you like to go from here? I want to go where you just went. Pay attention to the changes in volume or speed. Usually the stuff that's a little more conflicted tends to get moved through rather quickly, or the voice sometimes will drop. Or it becomes kind of a parenthetical side or a footnote to something else. You know, I was doing this, and John anyway. So anyway, and then they pick up the thread, what they just added, you want to come back on that. I noticed you were talking about John, and then you said something about John, this, that, and the other thing. Would you mind going, what was that about? You want to go back to the stuff that looks like it was a throwaway. Say as little as possible. Nonverbal cues are usually preferred to encourage the counselee to keep talking. Again, allow for silence. The number of people that I've worked with who later on say, first of all, I don't know why I told you all of that. Or I've never told anybody about all of that. Or I'll even get on an airplane, and I got on in San Francisco, I got off in Miami, and a woman was sitting next to me, and she talked probably the better part of those 5 hours, crying, telling me all about kinds of stuff. And then she looked at me as we were landing, and she goes, I don't know why in the world I told you all of that. I didn't tell her I was a psychologist or anything. Just let her go, you know? She goes, I don't know why I told you all of that. People want to be heard, not just listened to. They want to be heard. We need to give them space and time to be heard. Unhurried hearing. That should be his next book. Beware of trial balloons. By trial balloons, I mean it's not infrequent where somebody will give you a non-issue to first of all see if you're competent, and second to see if you're confidential before they give you the real issue. So if they come in the first session and say, what is it you'd like to talk about? Well, I want to talk about this. Okay. And then you spend your 6, 8, 10 sessions talking about that, but that wasn't really the issue. And the reason being is they were trying to see how you handled that non-issue. And if you're not competent dealing with it, I'm not going to tell you what the real issue is, because if you can't handle that, you're not going to be able to handle this. And second, if I hear something from someone else in the church or from your wife where I'm treated differently, I know that this is not trustworthy. So it's not uncommon for people to give you trial balloon issues that are not the real issue. You have to establish trust, work through those rather quickly, and give some confidence there. Frequently, by the second, third, fourth session, they'll come in and say, you know, I realize I've been talking about this. Actually, I think I'm trying to avoid talking about that. Okay, well, let's go there. Managing excessive emotion. Note obvious issues that the counselee omits or minimizes. Allow them to wander for a bit. This is usually an effort at some kind of self-protection, or they're trying to control themselves. If they're talking about something that's emotionally laden, but they're not showing emotion that's appropriate to what's going on, that's usually an indication that there's an unresolved conflict. And so what they'll do is they'll start talking about something that's emotionally laden, then come back and they'll start talking about things that are content not attached to the emotionality. Instead of jumping in and saying, gee, it looks like you're really depressed, but you're trying to avoid saying you're very depressed. You don't want to force them in that. What they're trying to do is kind of dose themselves and protect themselves to ease into it a little more carefully. I allow people to do that, because the other thing I want to see is how well can they emotionally self-regulate. And I want to see how they self-regulate. I want to see what the defenses are so that we can work with that. It's all grist for the mill. But I'm not going to let them go through the entire session avoiding the emotionality that rightly attach a particular thing that they're sharing with me. I may at some point step in and say, it's interesting to me. We've been talking about things here that would seem on the surface to be so emotionally difficult. And yet, I haven't actually heard that emotion. Have you noticed that? And that's usually enough, boom, to move them into the emotion. Comment on the observed behavior rather than offer interpretations. Don't say, I think you're depressed. That's an interpretation. You look sad to me. That's an observation. I think you're angry. That's an interpretation. It appears in your eyes that there's a lot of stuff being pent up. That's an observation. People who can defend themselves against an interpretation, you can't really defend yourself against an observation. I think you're depressed. No, I'm not. Well, now you're being defensive. I'm not that either. Well, now I think you're just being obstinate. Obstinate, I think I'm done with you. But it's much more difficult to say, to defend yourself or to push back on, you look sad to me. They could say, because I don't feel sad. They can go with that, but they can't go with the interpretation. Dose emotionally upset counselees as necessary. You can alternate between emotionally laden content and objective data. What do I mean by that? Sometimes people will come into a counseling context and they're overwhelmed by emotions. They're crying, they can't catch their breath, and so on. And you say, how in the world do I manage this? It's just this fire hydrant of emotionality. If they can't dose themselves, you can dose them by moving them into content. Excuse me, Mary, could I just ask you a question here? Remind me, please. You were born in Wichita, was it? Yes. Yeah. And again, how long have you been married? These are all questions that are not emotionally toned. Remember, remind me again, how many children do we have? 3 children. And their ages? Focus on the content and allow her to emotionally or him to emotionally reconstellate. Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful to me. You were saying, now we're back into the emotion. So I'm helping dose those emotions. I'm also helping the counselee learn how to dose their own emotion. I can move from emotion into content, and when they reconstellate, back into the things that are emotionally laden. Remain calm, but not stoic. You're not indifferent, but don't get caught up or carried away. If you start getting anxious, they're going to be more anxious. If you're alarmed, they're going to be all the more alarmed. If they say something to you and you act shocked, that's probably the last time you're going to hear anything shocking from them. I've had people confess murders to me. I've had people confess that they have other families in other countries that the spouse in this country does not know about. I've had people confess all kinds of things to me. And I hear it all as though I already knew it. I don't want to. You did what? What's that like? You can't, you can't go there. You've heard it all before, nothing, and at this point, after 45 years, there really isn't a whole lot I haven't heard. But you're not shocked, you're not alarmed, you're not scared, you're not overwhelmed. Inside, if you're going, oh my word, that's okay. That's probably an indication maybe I'm in over my head and I'm going to be making a phone call after this session. But don't truncate the session and convey to the person you're working with that that's deplorable, or that's shocking, or that's alarming, or I'm frightened for you, or those kinds of things. That will accelerate the issues. So what do we do in counseling? I find that rarely do counselees present their own goals. It is a rare day, unless people have been in counseling before and they come in and say, you know, I previously developed a list of like 6 things I wanted to work on. I think I've worked on 2, I'm down to number 3, and here's what I'd like to work on with you. Would you be willing to work with me on this? Yeah, cool. People usually come in and they say, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, this is not going well, my marriage is a mess, financially we're stressed, I'm not getting along with one of the elders, I think that they're trying to push me out, whatever those things are. And you say, what is it specifically that you'd like to work on together with this? Well, I don't know. Usually, like coming to an attorney, they say, I don't know, I just want it to go away, and I want you to fix it. And so what I do with people is I try to assemble a list of issues that are of concern to that individual. Tell me a little bit about some of the things that are on your mind. I'd like to work on this, I'd like to work on that, I'd like to work on this other thing. Recently, had a couple at our home. We were able to have a session prior to them coming to our house to do an intensive, a mini sabbatical at our house, and they were able to list like 6 or 8 things that they were interested in working on. And between then and the time they arrived, I was able to take a few of those and assemble them under a rubric and say, it seems to me like here's a central theme, and we could work on this one day, this another day, this another day. And that kind of an organization went well. If you prioritize those things and they say, of those 6, if we could work on one together, what would it be? You don't have to work on all 6. What's the one that seems to stick out to you? Well, this one's been the longest lasting or causes me the most problems. Start with that one. What's really neat is not only will they work on that issue with you, but it will have a generalizing effect for the other issues as well. You're teaching them also how to work on issues in addition to solving that particular issue. It's kind of like learning a language. Those of you who did Greek and Hebrew and all the rest, hardest part of learning a language is learning how to learn a language. Once you've learned the language, then you can start putting in the principal parts and all the rest of the stuff to figure out how to learn other languages. It's the same thing in counseling. Once you figure out how to work through issues to resolution, it can have a generalizing effect. So you don't have to work on all 6 things. Work on one. Counseling. I usually recommend something that's time limited. 6 to 8 sessions is pretty reasonable for counseling. You go much beyond that, I think you're doing more therapy than you are counseling. You set an appropriate goal. An appropriate goal is one that is biblical, moral, healthy, desirable. It's a change in thinking, behavior, or feeling that they want to see happen, and it should be specific, observable, and contextualized. I just want to communicate better with my husband. One of the questions that you want to ask is, what would that look like? When you say, I want to communicate better, if he was here and the 2 of you are communicating with each other right now, what would that look like? Well, right now it would look like this. How would you like to see that different? If you're communicating with each other and it was, quote, better, what does that actually look like? Now you're able to offer something objective. Well, I'd want to be heard. What does it look like and feel like for you when you're really heard? Well, I'm not interrupted, and he's looking me in the eye, and he's not distracted, and he's not looking at his phone, and he's turned off the well, this is very objective, right? You can start working on these things that become measurable and observable and verifiable. Counseling is not simply telling people what to do. That's coaching. Here's my problem. All right, here's what you do. You do this and that and then this other thing. That's more coaching. Counseling is, as a rule, trying to avoid being confrontational in that way and assisting the person at arriving at their own solutions as long as they're biblical, moral, and appropriate. Again, if people generate their own responses and answers to their issues, one, they're more likely to believe that they're true, and second, they're more likely to follow through with them than if you tell people what to do. I want to avoid that. Don't rush in with the solution. I see this happen very frequently. Again, you might be getting trial balloons, right? Well, my husband's, okay, well, here's what you need to do. You just need to submit. And I'm giving you 3 verses here. I'd like you to read these every morning. And then Sunday, you tell me how it's going. Let's close in prayer. That's just not going to work. When a counselee is stuck, I can't figure out what I want to do, encourage them to explore various options. Well, I don't know what to do to get them to listen to me. Well, what are some thoughts on what you could potentially do? They don't have to be good, or we don't have to evaluate. Just what are some of the options that come to mind? Get them in the practice of generating their answers. That's part of counseling. Because what I want to do is effectively work myself out of a job. I don't want the next problem that you have that you come back to me necessarily. You may want to come back to me. Indeed, you may need to come back to me. But ideally, the next issue that comes along, you say, I need to, well, you know what? I think I know what he would do. Let me think about this for a minute. I've learned to generate options, and I want that to become a generalizing effect. Probe the values that inform each potential option. Allow the counselee to evaluate the same. Sometimes people come up with unbiblical options. Well, I think maybe an open marriage. That's certainly an option. That is an option. Now, so you list all these and then go back and say, from a biblical perspective, given your Christian conviction, how do you evaluate these? Not, here's how I evaluate them. How do you evaluate these? You're discipling, you're guiding, you're counseling, you're fostering spiritual development, biblical theological reflection, faithfulness. I think that's good shepherding. Allow the counselee to select the option, though, that squares with biblical, theological, moral, and ethical standards. Well, I think the open marriage thing, I think that's the one we're going to go with. Okay. Let's evaluate that. What is your understanding of Scripture's teaching on marriage or family or whatever that issue is? That can be very, very helpful. Monitoring progress toward the goal. Establish both intermediate and long-term changes that work towards specific, observable, contextualized goals. So if I'm working with somebody for 8 sessions, what do we want to see happen by 4 sessions? And then what do we want to see happen by 2 sessions? Which means that for this next week, why don't we give some thought to this, that, and the other thing? Or you had mentioned two things that you thought you might try to foster a little deeper connection with your husband. Maybe we take this week to try those out. Let's talk about how that went next week. So you're taking those goals and you're backing into them to keep you on track toward progress. Instead of just every session is a session in and of itself. That can keep you into that 6 or 8 sessions. And if you're making good progress, you can get to that 8 sessions, you're almost there, you can always say, you know what would you think of just another session or 2? Because it seems like the finish line's right there. I don't know, what are your thoughts? Generally, people will take it. Now, I learned how to do this because I did my internship and postdoc at Kaiser Hospital. And I did mostly emergency room work, but I did a lot of outpatient work as well. And you were limited to 8 sessions, or you could go back in and propose an additional 2 sessions, rarely an additional 2 sessions after that. And so it was 8 sessions standard, sometimes 10, rarely but occasionally 12. And you learn how to work in structured time to do not therapy, but you're doing counseling. And that became a very helpful program for keeping people on task. I tend to keep subsequent counseling sessions focused on that overarching goal. Sometimes you can reframe it. They come in the next session and say, well, how is your week gone? I did this, okay. And if they start getting a little loose, okay, now again, we're talking about working on the communication skills with your spouse. I think that's the goal we're working on together, right? Yeah. So now here, and then you keep things in that frame. Keep it in that lane instead of allowing it to drift too far out so you can keep it on task. Attend to both the content and the process, meaning the things they're saying, but then how they're saying it. What are they avoiding? What are they omitting and skipping through? What are they rushing through? Describe the behavior as appropriate. Avoid the labels in you are statements. You know, you are so silly. I can't, but you don't want to go there with people. Oh, that was dumb. You're not that dumb. You can't, that's going to be your last session. You know what? I think you're neurotic. That's your last session. Okay? Describe the behavior as appropriate, avoid the labels, and so on. Summarize and recognize progress at the arrival of intermediate mini goals. Well, that's great. So we talked about 2 different ways you were going to try interacting with your husband to see if there could be more attention given in your communication. Sounds like 1 didn't go as well as 2, but 2 seems like it may have had some traction. Is that your assessment? Yeah, that's good. So how do we build on that? How do we lean into that skill to deepen that? So you mark it and move on. Making referrals. As I mentioned before, no counselor is good enough to do it all. Even the best consult and refer. When I teach advanced pastoral counseling, I tell the students that largely this is a class on how to make referrals. That's only a slight exaggeration. Make good use. Build networks in your community of people who are professionally trained. Take them out to lunch. Hey, I'm a pastor in the community. I do some pastoral counseling, but I really want to get connected with somebody with whom I can develop a relationship for referrals. I'm wondering if I could grab lunch with you and talk to you about what I sometimes see and what some of my needs would be. I'd like to make sure you'd feel comfortable working with people who are coming from a spiritual orientation and your comfortability with that. Is that something you'd be willing to do? I don't know if a single psychologist or psychiatrist would say, yeah, no, I'm not interested. They will. And you can develop those kinds of networks, and those people can really help you. In counseling, it's what you don't know that can harm both you and the other, and we don't know what we don't know, and we don't know that we don't know. So getting supervision, being able to run things by somebody who can look over your shoulder and say, ooh, wait, do you see that? Oh. How many times have we heard of churches, particularly in counseling centers, getting sued or having problems because something that upon a post-mortem done by professionals was just a glaring issue of concern that just wasn't seen? We need to be careful. When you don't know what to do, know what not to do. And you can rarely go wrong by consulting and referring. Counseling, as opposed to therapy, is time limited. You evaluate your progress at regular intervals. I normally, after 2, 3, 4 sessions, will say, we're working on this together. I'm wondering how you feel we're doing with each other. Has this been helpful to you? Now, keep in mind that in counseling with people, and I tell people this with some frequency, if I'm doing my job properly and you're doing your job properly, chances are good that you're going to feel worse before you feel better. Why? Because we're taking a wound that has had a scab growing over it multiple times. It keeps getting picked and flicked and bleeding, but it hasn't really been cleaned out. We're going to clean that out together. That's going to hurt. And so I don't want people to have an expectation of a rush into health. Session 2, woo, and the burden of my heart rolled away, and everything. That's, if we're making what's unconscious conscious, and we're looking at the issues as they really are, that's going to be hard. And if we're going to sit with them long enough to put handles on them where we can maneuver them, that's also going to be hard. And so more often than not, if we're doing our job properly with one another, chances are good you're going to feel worse before you feel better. So you don't want to evaluate too quickly and dismiss, but you do want to evaluate to make sure. And in those moments where people are saying, yeah, I'm actually feeling worse, do you feel like you're being heard, and do you feel like we're on the right track? Even if they're feeling like the progress is not there as they would wish. You might want to give it another session or two. If they're still not feeling better, I think maybe at this time we might want to consult and see if somebody else bringing that component of expertise to this would be helpful. And let me just pastor you. That's good. Refer if you've not established confidence or trust. There's insufficient progress, or after the agreed number of sessions. So we have about 10 minutes. Is this helpful to go through this together? Yeah, okay, good. Questions, comments, anything that I can help with? Yeah. The question is, how do I handle situations where somebody comes in, doesn't look like they initially want to work anything through, but they're just kind of dumping a whole litany of problems and issues. I let them dump a whole litany of problems and issues. One of the things that would go through my mind in a moment like that is there anybody who has been willing to listen to this? Chances are good that the answer is no, which is why they're in there all bottled up and they're spewing it all on me. There's something therapeutic about just being heard. And by the way, I want to tell you, your effectiveness as a counselor is far more dependent upon who you are than what you know or what you do. And if you don't know what to do, be present with people. You will never go wrong sitting in a hospital corner and offer your willingness to read Scripture and pray. You cannot go wrong. If you don't know what to do, and you do much more than that, even Job's friends were doing great as long as they kept their mouths shut. It's only when they decided it's time for me to start counseling that they got off base. You are a public symbol of the sacred. And sometimes people want to be with that which they associate with that which is sacred in their life. Listen. I'd hear it all. Eventually, they're going to run out of steam. And if they're giving me this whole litany of things, it's probably very content-driven because they haven't had a lot of time to attach their emotions to anything that they've told me. It's just, this is a problem, that's a problem, this is a problem, this person's a problem, this other thing's a problem. It's all been content, 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 content. So where do I want to go next? Emotion. Mary, that's a long list of things. As you were reciting that to me, I was wondering, what are some of the feelings that attach to all of that? Now counseling begins. And they'll start talking about all that stuff. Pay attention to what people mention first. That tends to be the primacy effect that's very powerful in counseling. If they listed it in that litany first, then you say, what are some of the feelings as you were talking about that? Well, my feelings as relates to Mary, and if Mary was number one on the first list, and now Mary is number one on the subsequent list where you're attaching the feeling to the content, that's probably the place to start. Well, you've listed out a long number of things. It was interesting that Mary was the first thing you talked about, and the first thing to which you attached feelings. Would it be good for maybe us to go back there and unpack that just a little more? There's going to be some fruitfulness in that. But I would let them go. Again, I shared this morning, I don't know if you were with us, but I sat in one session with somebody for the better part of an hour and I didn't say a word, nor did they. But the next session was incredibly fruitful because they said, you're the only person I've ever known where I could sit with somebody for the better part of an hour and not feel compelled to say anything. That's powerful. What's it like to live your life not feeling like anybody's willing to give you space to just be and is content to just be with you? That's powerful stuff to explore with somebody. Does that help? Yes. Okay, yeah. Correct. Were you here this morning? No, okay. Yeah, I talked about the limits of confidentiality, and one of the things that I mentioned this morning that I think is a good idea, and you could probably contact a local community mental health or a psychologist, psychiatrist, an attorney or whatever, is to get kind of just a disclosure form. And the disclosure form sets the parameters for your counseling with people, and in that you specify the limits of confidentiality. And in there you would have language that would say something that generally the things that are shared in a pastoral counseling context are held in confidence. However, clergy in the state of Colorado or whatever are mandatory reporters. And there are certain conditions under which I'm mandated by law to disclose certain information. For example, if you pose a real and immediate threat to yourself or someone else, you're gravely disabled, or if there's instances of elder abuse, child abuse, or if somebody is disabled. By law, I have to report those things. Likewise, if you confess to me that you intend to commit a crime, I'm mandated by law to report that. So those are things that you put in there so that you protect your counseling center or your church from getting sued. We just live in I'm married to an attorney. I'm just telling you, we live in a litigious world. And churches are sued over these things all the time. And you can protect yourself by having a confidentiality form that show that here are the limits of confidentiality. They've signed it and realize if I say these things. So, yeah.
Is that even if you're not like an LPC?
Yes, even if...
From a liability standpoint?
I think from a liability standpoint, I mean, anybody can really sue anybody these days. I think that just having a pastoral care form where you indicate what the limits of confidentiality are, just giving what's called informed consent, if you will. For psychologists called mandatory disclosure. We're mandated by law. You have to disclose what the limits of confidentiality are. I would strongly encourage you to do that even if you're not licensed. It's just going to protect you in a pastoral counseling context.
Kind of following the dump truck question. How do you help someone when they come in often it's like a marriage situation? Pastor, I'm going to tell you my marriage is terrible and my spouse is the worst, and you just wait till you hear all the terrible things my spouse has done, and they just go on and on. How do you help turn that and help them to see that within themselves when they're just thoroughly convinced, if only God would just fix my spouse, I'd be that much better?
Yeah, well, the question is, you get one spouse into counseling and they're spewing on the other spouse. How do you get that spouse to be able to acknowledge their own stuff in all of this? And one of the things is in marriage counseling, eventually you got to get both parties in the room. And I tell people with whom I do marriage counseling that your marriage is my patient, not either of you. And so, when I get them both in the room. I don't tell the person the first session that, well, thank you, Mary, for throwing your husband under the bus. Just, I'm here to treat your marriage, not you. It's like, but there's ways to get resistant spouses into counseling. Now I'm going to just start putting cards out on the table. So if I call you and say, hey, I'd like to have a conversation, he's trying to get me in. So one of the things that I've done before that's been very effective is I'll call the spouse who's resistant. And I'll say, as you are aware, I'm working with your wife, Sally, and it's been very, very challenging. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to come to a session and help me to better help her. So I make Mary what we call the IP. She's the identified patient. You're now the ally with me against Mary. Spouses can't wait to come in and help me fix the bad parent. Now, of course, now I've got them in the door. I'm establishing trust. I'm hearing him. I'm being able to attend to him. Thank you, this is really helpful. There's a lot more, though, here, isn't there? Yeah. Would you be willing to come back and help me again next week with this? Yes. Now I've got him in with me. Eventually, I can make the turn and say, it's been my experience that rarely are marriage issues 100-0. And I realize that if we tried to apportion the relative contribution of both of you to making the marriage both a joy and challenging, that you'd probably disagree. It's very easy to say, if you could get him, well, if you could get her, and we'd sit here for a very long time and probably make very little progress. can I suggest that we try a different approach? Imagine that we had a hamper of socks. And you've got socks, and you've got socks. What I'd like to do is take some time exploring with you which ones are my socks. And you can say, not which ones are, these are your socks, but which ones are my socks? Because each of you are contributing in significant ways, both to it being a blessing and to being a challenge. And again, well, it's mostly him, it's mostly, I think we all would agree that it's always the other person. But if we spend 100% of our time focused on whatever percentage it is that you feel you're contributing that's making it challenging, I think we can get somewhere. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to work with me to that end. Now you're off and running. Does that help? One more, and then actually I'm supposed to speak downstairs again, so I need to go. Yeah.
Related here, marriage counseling. What if the situation is not together because betrayal, there's some betrayal trauma, I'm not ready to meet with my spouse together?
Yeah. Then what I do is I meet with them individually, but I try to stay away from what we would refer to as ex parte communications. In other words, I'm willing to hear about you and the things that are challenging for you, but if you're going to come in and talk about your spouse, and then next week I come in and I hear about the other spouse, and then in your next session you go, well, what did she say about me when you met with her last Wednesday night? Well, let me report this to you. And then you go back and report to her, and she comes in and then says, why in the world would you tell him that? That's not what I said, and I thought that this was confidential. Well, you should hear what he said about you, and it's not all that flattering. So we're not doing counseling. We're mediating something here, that's not going to work. And so I'm willing to listen to you and I'll listen to the other person if things are intense. We have had, actually, who have visited our home, we've had a pastor's wife live with us for 2 months who wanted to get a divorce. And I worked with her residentially in our house for 2 months. Every day, 8 to 2. I went to the church office, did my work. Next day, 8 to 2 for 2 months. Finally got to she got to a place where she was willing to say, okay, let's invite my husband in. And we invited the pastor in, and they stayed with us for another month together. And we put the marriage back together. Let me pray, and then I've got to run downstairs. I'm sorry, they want me to say something. So can I do that? But you've got my email address, really long, 1990s, and I'll show you my cargo shorts if you want to see them. Show you that I'm really from the 90s. But please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you. And I've got cards with me both here and then at the Veritas table down in the lobby as well. So please call on me for anything, anytime, anywhere. It'd be a joy to help you in helping others. This is really my great privilege and joy. Father, thank you for the time we've had together today. Pray now that you would dismiss us with your blessing. And we pray it in Christ's name and because we love you as your children. Amen. Blessings to you.